Begin this panel from vision to reality towards a new society. The chair is Jumana Abu Oksa. And apart from the things that I'm going to present about Jumana, she was also a very, very active member of the steering committee of this conference in the last 6 months, and was a senior speaker and also very, very active in the choice and shaping of this conference. Jumana has worked in various human rights organizations in North Africa and the Middle East in the last 6 years. She's worked in several international and local organizations such as the ICTJ and the International Legislation Association and various other organizations, and conducted her research in the Human Rights Organization in Ireland. She's also did her first and second degrees in Zari and Malta University, and apart from her psychology studies and gender studies, she's also taught in the Al-Quds taught in the university. First of all, I congratulate the speakers. I am very pleased that you're here. I thank all of the organizers and all of the participants and everybody that's working, and also the people who've come to listen. And I want to begin, first of all, with the key issue around which is the entire Palestinian conflict evolves in regards to the self-definition of Palestinians, the basis of which is the return of refugees. Now, this issue really means is that every person believes, respects the right for self-realization under the the authority of international law, meaning we have to acknowledge the right of refugees to return, to receive compensation for all of the damages that were incurred as a result of what happened, and also this is the way to reach an equitable solution. Now, according to this and the basic rights of the Palestinian people, BADIL and Zochrot really discussed South Africa, and also discussed particularly the rights of the Palestinians in terms of return, and concluded the meetings and the last visit with writing or drafting a document about the realization of the right of return and the ways in which to do this, talking about raising awareness, about encouraging and promoting the local initiatives, and also the establishment of local and international networks. Now, this Cape Town manifest dealt with the vision and future possibilities of the life that will be after return. This is really a process of democratization of institutions that will ensure the right of return, social and economic and political justice, and also a non-violent and non-aggressive society. What happened in South Africa happened because of attempts after the apartheid. South Africa is a rich source of study from their experience, specifically in Cape Town, because the West Coast and Cape Town specifically are the most clear and exemplary examples of injustice and inequality, and everybody turns their eyes to that to learn. Now, after many visits and many meetings and many proposals, the group sat down to learn everything that needs to be learned and summarize them in 3 key points: the right of return, which is the first, compensation for the damages, and assessment of the damages. Now, these issues are all open to discussion, and we wanted to come to the drafting of this paper, including all of these points, and that's what we're going to discuss today. From vision to reality towards a new society, we have 4 speakers. Each is going to talk in his or her language. We have we have until today we have Noa Levi, who began her political association with the youth movement Hadash and in various social campaigns and in educational works in various frameworks. Now we can say that Noa is an activist who happened to become a lawyer over the years. Her specialization did under the firm of Michael Sfarad, where she took care of land and real estate trials of Palestinians in criminal allegations against Palestinians and petitioned to the Supreme Court against illegal taking of lands in the West Bank. Right now she's writing her thesis, her master's thesis in Tel-Aviv University in the law faculty about interventions of the ISA in the various election committees for education and religion in Arab society, and she is part of the junior faculty there. Now, after Noa, we're going to hear from Ani Asher. Ami Asher was born in 1971 in Tel Aviv. He has a first degree in psychology and general history. He is a translator and an editor in Hebrew and English. He lives with his wife Merav and his two children Uri and Maya. He joined Zochrot 4 years ago after tours of Palestinian villages in Tel Aviv. Since then, he has participated in a series of interviews, documented interviews that were done with Jewish soldiers from 1948. Now, the documentation and analysis of these testimonies of Israeli soldiers are part of a huge database that he has amassed and have been been brought into a book that is called Talks About the Old Israel. The next to speak is Ro'i Silberberg. I'm going to present him in English, despite the fact that he will present his article in Hebrew.
Educator, working in the field of social activism and shared society since 2004. He's the founder and co-director of the Association for the Promotion of Spoken Arabic. Ro'i gained a second master degree from Malta University under the supervision of Professor Dizafi of Madrid University. The thesis title is Prospects for Equality for the Palestinian Citizens of Israel. Since 2008, Ro'i has been studying for PhD in Haifa University under the supervision of Professor Gur Ziv. His thesis is titled The Theoretical Challenges of Peace Education. In 2009, he worked at the US Congress as Tom Lantis Fellow and received the Lantis Human Rights Medal. He worked for Representative Dennis Kochiman on the issue of the Department of Peace. And our last speaker is here from BADIL. His name is Thaer Hastings. Thaer is a researcher from BADIL Resource Center. Thaer graduated with a BA degree from the University of Washington in 2011, where his research focused on the intersections of human rights, politics, and law in Palestine, Israel. Prior to working for BADIL, he completed a reporting fellowship at the Alternative Information Center. Noa Levi תפתח את הפאנל הזה בהצגת נייר עמדה
Noa Levi will begin her talk about return and compensation tracks and the second occupant as a case study. She's going to talk about Cape Town and the question of how can we prepare for the return of the refugees and what kind of a state can we propose to that future society, if you would. Hello to everybody. I'm really excited to speak here today. I think that this is really a very important, significant, thrilling event and something that really, I don't know what to say. I thank you so much to the organizers. Yes, a round of applause, certainly. Okay, well, I came to talk about today the Cape Town documents and the continued document that was amended to it and added to it. It was written by myself and Eitan Bornstein, who's also here, with consultation with refugees from the Haifa refugee camp. I'm just going to give you a background a little bit first. You got actually background by our moderator, but I'm going to give you my background or my take on it. Oftentimes, the Israeli left, so to speak, has from the 19th onward liked to conduct meetings, Israeli-Palestinian meetings, that try to sort of resolve the conflict. I'm talking about this now quite cynically, actually, because we've despaired from the failure of all these broad hopes that were in the past. But in a way, I think that this daring, this ability to touch things that seemed untouchable, unresolvable, did give a lot of people the awareness, the understanding that things can be done, that not all is lost, and that hope is something that's very precious. It's priceless. You can't give up hope when you're fighting for justice. In Cape Town, we tried to do something similar, things that have been done in the past and has already been previously attempted. We tried to draft together, Israelis and Palestinians, a formula that could be agreed on by both parties, where basically realization of the right of return, where both people could agree. I mean by this that it's not comfortable for either side, but it also everybody gets something. Meaning we really tried, both parties, Palestinians and Israelis, and I think not everybody, but a lot of refugees that tried to be there and raise their strong points, the things that were most painful to them, most important to the Palestinian side, and also things that they are particularly sensitive to, things that are inconceivable by the Israelis or unacceptable, and really deliberately try to touch those hard places, the demons, the threats, and see whether we can provide a proposal for a solution. Maybe it's not the solution, but really raise an issue that we say, no, it's not a partial solution, we'll talk later about numbers. No. Really provide a practical solution with practical means that are detailed, where later on everybody can play with and say, I don't like this, I do like that, I think this is more, I think this is less. These documents, the Cape Town documents, were comprised of 3 different documents, each dealing with a different subject. One that dealt with preparing for the return, meaning actions that must be taken to prepare the ground, so to speak, for the return of the Palestinian refugees. And the key point that I will talk about today is return, reparation, and compensation, that deals with lands, that talks about monies, and an actual return. And in the second and the third part, which is a vision for a new country, a new state, something that's already been talked about today and certainly just as important as the first. Now, even then already, I talked about lands, monies, territories. As a Marxist, I believe that the material side, the strong material side, is at the end of the day, which is the tiebreaker, where things blow up, where things nobody can agree with. And that's what we wanted to touch on, and that's why we touched on it first, deliberately. When we thought to ourselves, what are we facing? I think initially the principle, the thing that really the theme that was everywhere was that there were 2 key elements that must be addressed. The first, the symbolic element, meaning the need to answer the symbolic importance of return, the meaning of return in terms of the identity of the refugees, the identity of people coming back, all the difficulties that are so volatile that have to do with this. And on the other hand, the materialistic things. These people are people, the refugees, they're human beings, they're old, they're for 65 years, they've been living, in many cases, they're living a life which is a non-life, a hard life in refugee camps. And if we want to give them a real right to return to Israel, that means also thinking what are the physical conditions that are required so that they can live a healthy life here. And now from this thought of these 2 elements, I'm going to present to you what we drafted. First of all, there was a basic principles document. I suggest that you read it. It's very long. I'm not going to read it out to you, but I'm going to say generally, we agreed that the Palestinians have an inherent right to decide whether to come back or not, meaning it's not somebody that decides from on high, you come back, but everybody individually can decide for themselves. we also agreed to ensure the human rights of all of the future residents of this country, whether Palestinians, Jews, or whatever. We agreed on principles of egalitarianism, and I think something that for me was very important, that the return does not bring us back to the situation of before 48. Many people talked about this in a sort of romantic terms, but when you think about it in terms of real future society, then there's also a question, who gets land? The people who had land? Or the people who lived on the land? Meaning the power plays and the economic structure that was in before 48. Are we going to replace them now? No. And we understood and agreed completely that that's not our goal. That we're not talking about a division of possessions. We're not talking about bringing back reality to 1948. That's not what we're looking for. After the basic principles that we agreed on, there are many, and as I suggest you should read them, we went on to the drafting of the actual return. What are we talking about? And here we talked about 4 tracks, so to speak. I am going to conclude with the symbolic. I'm going to start with the material, if I may. The material thought was that we have a lot of refugees, hundreds of thousands, I don't know, maybe millions, I don't know, many, that live in refugee camps. These people need the return in order to live a reasonable life. These people, first of all, and for most important, we have to build a lot for them. And Israel has had such waves. Gideon Levy talked about this yesterday. In the 90s, we had 1 million previous Soviet Union people who came, citizens who came here to Israel. So this is a track that, in terms of the documents, this is the 4th document. This is basically residential housing, urban housing, or whatever you want to call it. We need housing. Projects that are supposed to build close to employment centers, within cities, existing cities, whole new neighborhoods that will be suitable to the needs of the many returnees. This is basically the 4th track, which is the mass track. An additional track, which is less symbolic, say, is for people that have also been mentioned in previous panels here. They were discussed also when they talked about the testimonies of refugees. Many of the refugees say, I live where I live. I am not going to now uproot myself from where I live and go to Palestine, where I haven't lived in Palestine for over 60 years. I don't belong there anymore, in the real current sense now. But I do want a passport. That's what I want. I want an ID card. I want to know that my children can be able to decide and whether they want to come back or not. I want my children to maybe go study if they want in Palestine. And I think this is a little bit similar to a lot of Jewish Israelis now, particularly Ashkenazi Jews, that oftentimes manage to get themselves passports of previous of European passports because of their grandparents and parents who were in the Holocaust. So this is the 2nd track. This is the fast track, meaning a refugee that wants to get some sort of compensation package and a passport. You don't have to really think about it too much. They should get it immediately. That's not a problem. Now we get to the tracks which are that have to do with the actual return, meaning dealing with the really more challenging emotions and the challenging needs of the refugees. The 3rd track that we drafted was the community track. This is a track that examines those same refugees that do want to come back to their actual village, whether they're refugees from outside Israel, whether they're displaced people within Israel, whatever. Our drafts talked about preparation, in which whole task forces or teams will examine basically the regions in which there were Palestinian villages in 48. And now there's nothing there instead, because the agreement was you don't break something that is existing in order to come back to the past. That's what we agreed on. We're not going to break existing or demolish existing places. But there are areas in which there was a Palestinian village, and 60 years now there's been nothing. There's nothing there. So let's offer many ideas, many options, and that was one of the things that we agreed on. Here you could build a village and a park. There we can build a city. Here we can build employment centers. There we can build factories. boundaries, meaning thinking and really planning what can be done for communities at large and give many options to them, not just one. Concurrently, the community track also talks about gatherings of the community. They want to come back to a specific site so that they can consolidate amongst themselves how many people are coming back, how are they coming back, what of the realistic possibilities that are offered to them do they want to adopt, meaning that future planning will be done in collaboration and led by the community of refugees themselves. They decide, while examining the actual reality on the ground, what is possible. And in many cases, and in fact I would say in all of the cases, and I'm pretty radical, but in all of the cases in which the village is still there, where the people who used to live there have now there's twice the number of people, 3 times, 10 times the number of people because they've had children and expanded. It's not true that not all of them will be able to come back. This is also something that has to be examined by the community itself. If there's only a place for 1/6 of the current community, they have to decide who's coming back or not. They have to decide it democratically. This is their responsibility and their right. And of course, obviously, those who won't be able to come back to their specific village will be able to come back to maybe the other tracks, the mass tracks that I called of urban planning, of urban projects, because everybody should get a possibility of residence and employment. Now, the most difficult track is very, very reduced, very limited, but also with the most symbolic meaning. And that is the track of people, for them, the actual house, which they lived until 1948, is still there. The house exists. In these cases, I mean, there aren't many such cases. We assess that there are maybe until 1,000 homes, up until 1,000 homes that are still there. We're not talking about houses that are were demolished and something else was built on them, meaning the actual house is still there. You can see it in Jaffa, you can see it in Haifa, in Jerusalem, in Akko. You can see it in places in which there was an expulsion of the Palestinians and people took over the houses. So today the people who live in those houses are oftentimes people who bought those houses legally after several generations. Some of those people are Jews, some are Palestinians, Israeli Palestinians who now live in the houses of previous refugees and so forth. These cases are very sensitive because it's clear that the symbolic significance when the actual house is there, the refugee's house, he lived in that house and now the house still stands there. This is the house where I was born and grew up. These are cases in which almost all of the people, it's very difficult for people to let go of. And so we really went to the Haishek to consult about this and think what kind of solutions can we propose for those difficult cases. In Cape Town itself, we came up with a few principles of solution, but they didn't really conclude. There were still a few disagreements. Now we started thinking ahead and we said, okay, our solution is as follows. It's solid, yes, and now I'm going to propose it in a moment. I'm constantly taking you one step back and saying, wait a second. This is important because this is the heart of the symbolic meaning of return. It's very important to me that both sides see, first of all, that you don't leave the Palestinians out, you don't leave the refugees without what they came for. On the other hand, this is the place which is most threatening to the Israelis. The Israelis are saying, wait, you're going to get me out of my house now? I'm going to be thrown to the street after 60 years that I'm living in this house, and they're going to get their house, and I'm going to live in the street? No. So this existential fear of them or us, I think this is realized in those specific cases. We proposed a solution that the idea was, first of all, as many of the cases should be resolved by mediation, by agreement. That's already part of the Cape Town documents. The problem is, why should anybody agree? Meaning, saying mediation, it sounds really nice, but for us, the lawyers, we know that in order for mediation to work, you still need a law to anchor it. People know that they're compromising or not compromising, losing this, getting that in versus the law. I'm subject to law. So we tried to draft a law, a rule that would encourage as much as possible these two confrontants to agree, to compromise. The first scenario is that the refugees or their descendants demand that their house be returned to them and show some kind of evidence to prove that that is their house. Obviously here that we know that this is a quagmire, because how do you prove that this is your house? Most people can't. But in Cape Town they showed us in the restitution model that they proposed to us, which really didn't work in Cape Town, but for their own domestic reasons, they showed us that yes, there are alternative models for proof, things that work on many testimonies instead of documents. In places where there aren't documents, you can get a number of people testifying. There are models, there are alternative models to prove, and we could use them. So basically, in order for both sides to be able to agree, we decided that what we're talking about is a situation in which the people who are the ceding part, the people who are the compromising party, they get the full value of their house in return. What do you mean? I mean, obviously, you're not going to get the full value of your house, but usually it's accepted that when you give alternative residential proposals, you don't really give the full value of the house. When somebody is expelled from their house and they're compensated, they don't give them the market value of their house. Maybe they give them the historic value, maybe they assess it with a bit more, a few added extras, but the actual market value of the house is very rare for somebody to get. If that same person is chosen for public housing, for example, they get a house that is far less value than their real house. Now, we all know that the houses in Jaffa are called the Nakbawi, meaning that's how they're called very affectionately from the houses from before 1948. Houses are now very expensive. The Arab houses are gorgeous and luxurious. Their market value is now very high. Those who are giving up those houses get their market value, the actual market value of what they would get if they were sold today. And because of this, the first option given the opportunity to get the market value is the refugee, not the person living in the house. Meaning, if the refugee has the first right to give up the house but get the market value, get the money. In situations in which no one of the parties is willing to give up the house and get the money in its place, then we have now a creative solution according to which the actual possession of the house, the deed on the land and the plot and the actual building goes to the refugee, but the possession of the house is left in the hands of the current residents. What does this mean? Basically, we're separating between legal ownership and legal possession. First of all, this means that you don't have a right of inheritance, meaning if I am living in a house of a refugee and I don't want to give up my house and he doesn't want to give up for money, maybe I can live in this house and continue to, nobody will throw me out of the house, but I could never give it to my children when I die, so I lose. If I give it up the house and get the money, I could buy for my children another house, whatever. This is an incentive for people living in the houses now to give up the house for the refugee. Concurrently, the rationale is that each of the parties has an incentive for compromise. And this is a good thing, because then we say that's a model for compromise. This isn't a proposal. I have children. I don't want to get out of my house with my kids. We just settled here and we just bought the house and we're here. We don't want to leave. I don't want to leave the house. The refugees want to come back. Let's assume that I can come to some compromise with them. Wait a few years, wait till my kids are a bit older, and then I'll get out of the house and we'll split the money. I'll get, you, the refugee, get 50%, I get 50%, and then I can stay here a few more years. And that's how we'll do it. Meaning this opens the door to lots of kinds of settlements which are individual settlements between two conflicting families, the current residents versus the previous residents, where those people hold the deed, those people have possession, and everybody has something to lose if they don't compromise. And we hope that more and more people can be able to compromise so that no side feels that something has been taken away from them. This solution, which is just one idea, by the way, the idea behind it is that all of the obstacles, the hardest obstacles that are so difficult to resolve in this problem of the right of return, can be resolved with a little bit of creativity, a little bit of real goodwill. But we shouldn't erase any one of the parties. We shouldn't allow people to erase themselves, to think, oh yes, those Jews are a majority, then we'll have to work with the Jews. No, and let's give a little bit to the Palestinians. No, the conflict will continue that way. Or if we think that we have to give the Palestinians everything, all of the symbolism and all of the everything, and the Jews must be thrown out of their house, no, that again will lead to more conflict. I think will lead to more injustice as well, into another war. That's it. Thank you very much. No, it's okay.
תודה, נועה. עכשיו נמשיך עם עמי אשר.
We would like to continue now with Ami Asher, who will present his paper, Two Steps Forward, Return as a Necessity and a Dream, that will deal with the disappointment and hope that was around the discussion of the Cape Town documents, and with an emphasis on the important topics from the documents that present the various amendments suggested for the refugees and the return. Thank you as well. It's not exactly the topic of my talk. Perhaps it underwent some changes over time. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and I'd like to thank the organizers and Neva and all the others. Hold on. So, the quote is that what makes Zochrot unique, what it must always insist on, is to remain two steps before the mainstream. The quote is from Ahmed Hijazi. I owe this quote to Liat. Ahmed Hijazi is one of the founders of Neve Shalom, and he passed away about a year ago. And I'm presenting my own interpretation to these words, to what Zochrot must be. I joined Zochrot, like you said earlier, in 2009. Until 2009, I was what Arij defined earlier as the left. I was in a very comfortable place ideologically, and also for years, the place I was born in, Tel Aviv, it's also a very convenient location geographically, wherever the right of return was brought up. I call it a flamingo. I stand here with my fingers like this on my left foot, and I do not touch any Palestinian village, not even one. I'm on the sand dunes in a very convenient place. If there is a return, it won't really apply to me. And then all of a sudden I saw this ad in the Haaretz newspaper, if I remember correctly, with this group that calls itself Zochrot. I thought it was somehow a feminist organization. It seemed like quite a strange name, about the villages in Tel Aviv. What villages in Tel Aviv? I never heard about any village in Tel Aviv. And after I did devote some thought to it, I remembered, okay, there are these three houses in Sumel, Arlozrov at the corner of Even Gvirol, not far from where I was born. And I was curious about the tour, and we were standing there, and I remember how one of the refugees who lived there was standing beneath a strawberry tree, and all of a sudden I remembered, all of a sudden the penny dropped that all these strawberry trees in Tel Aviv were trees planted by Palestinians, and that these three homes that are located in Sumail are only some of the houses that used to be in Sumail, and that surrounding all these houses in Sumail, there were the Sumail lands. And that is already more within my Tel Aviv that's protected from the return. And this was a formative event for me. And then later on, we encountered some other trees. I don't know if you know that, but Tel Aviv, next to Kibbutz Galuyot, next to the Ayalon highway, there are three cypress trees, and they have a special island in the middle of the road for them in order not to uproot them, and it continues. You're always afraid that you'll get into these sycamore trees, but these sycamore trees, the three sycamore trees, belong to the village, to Salame. And they've remained there. The refugees, the people who planted these trees have scattered all across the land, and they're still being protected. And even as they expanded the road, they still kept them so that nobody will touch them. And when I thought about it, I thought there's a certain hierarchy. You have the flora, which is at the top of this hierarchy, and you have the dead, who still who have stayed in Salome because they're buried there. I suggest you visit this cemetery. It's not in such good shape. And there are the living who are scattered all over the world. Following this tour, I joined Zochrot, and in the winter of 2012, I was fortunate enough to go with Noa and with some others to South Africa. And in South Africa, what people kept saying to us, wherever we would go, they kept saying we were exactly in the situation you were in. We were so despaired. We saw no horizon, no option for a solution. We felt that we were banging our heads against the wall, and we couldn't see the change, even though it was just around the corner. And this is something I still carry with me today, because right now we really do not see this horizon. And I feel, and this came up yesterday and today, I feel that we are in this time warp. It's as if we're all stuck in 48, not just the Palestinians, the refugees who suffer from post-trauma. I think that this is something that we all share with them. History is somehow stuck. One of the things that truly influenced me in Cape Town was this place called the Institute for the Curing of Memories, or the Healing of Memories. There was a priest there called Michael Epstein, and he talked about the work he was doing with people, with whites and blacks. His work focused on the fact that both the white people and the black people are victims of the situation. I think we tended to see this in the past 2 days too much, as if the Jews are in a good state, and that will somehow will be spoiled following the return, and how not to spoil them. I don't think that the Jews are in such a good condition. I have children. I'm sure that at least some of you have children and grandchildren, and I'm certain that none of you want to go on with this good condition. I think it's a very bad condition. The way I see it, and I had arguments about it both in Cape Town, I think that the soldier who shoots is also a kind of victim. The person who deports, who expels, is also a kind of victim. Of course, we cannot compare between these two types of victimhood, but I think the two parties need to be cured, need to be healed, need redress. And this redress, this therapy is not to replace the practical ideas brought up by Noa. Of course, it's not to replace these ideas, but it's on top of these, and I think it's a very essential element. And later on, I also started to hold tours in Jaffa, and there's this anecdote I always love telling. I would love to come back from the sea. I would come back from the beach, and I would pass through a place in which the Palestinians would sit outside their house, because their house was very small, and probably they don't have an air conditioner, and they would sit outside their home. I would always say hi to them, and then one day they disappeared. Not one day, but I of course saw it all of a sudden. One day they had disappeared, and there were olive trees planted instead of them. So if we continue with this metaphor of the trees today, even the olive trees serve in order to conceal acts of erasing, of Nakba. If you go into the Rova parking lot in Jaffa, you can see these trees. They're a bit young, and one day when they'll be older, people will pass by and say, wonderful, what ancient trees, and they're instead of a place where a family used to live. And when I tell this story in one of my recent tours, I was with a group of American students, and this American student asked me, tell me, are you Palestinian? I found that to be funny, because, you know, it's so easy for us to identify who's Palestinian and who's not. And in Jaffa, we have that extra capability of detecting who's from Jaffa, who's from the West Bank, who's an Israeli Arab. And I asked him, why? Why do you think I'm a Palestinian? And he said, because Jews don't speak like that. This is what that American student said to me. And I'm very happy to see that here there are Jews who do talk like this. And another question he asked me, a more difficult question, he asked me, what does Zochrot do? I told him that Zochrot want to promote the right of return and bring Palestinians to Israel. So he asked me in English. Then I asked him, what do you mean? We're working on it. You know, we're strong. Every year we become stronger. And said, no, how many Palestinians have you brought back so far? 100, 200, 300? And I think that Initially, I laughed at this, but actually, I think this stayed on with me as a challenge because we've seen all these programs in the past 2 days, but actually we haven't managed to bring back not even one refugee yet. And I'd like to say something. If we'll go back to this quote, I'd like to say that Zochrot started as a Nakba movement. It started out as a Nakba movement. And one step ahead of being a Nakba movement is being a return movement. There are a lot of people who study who research the Nakba and study it. This is nothing new. They even do it in the Palmach, by the way. They have archives filled with shocking and atrocious testimonials, but it's only a part of, knowing what happened. It's not about reaching conclusions, because once you do reach these conclusions, you realize that this is the necessary outcome, that perhaps this is even the moral thing to do. But they don't think enough, they don't talk enough, definitely not amongst the Jewish sector, about the return as something that we want, as something that we really and truly want, not as some kind of a burden we're willing to take upon ourselves because we don't have any choice. I think that acts of planning, like we saw in La June, acts of writing, like the book we're going to launch tonight for those of you who plan to stay, are very significant. In my view, the question of how exactly do we plan, will it be Western planning or non-Western planning? The mere fact that we address this topic, that in and of itself helps the Jews to overcome that phobia from the return. And I am speaking intentionally, I keep talking about the Jews because I think that the way I understand Zochrot, the Jewish public are actually the main target population of Zochrot. We're not here to teach the Palestinians about the Nakba or the return. That's not our purpose. I think that the Jews have a special responsibility here, both because it is the Jews who have created or have perpetrated this injustice, and also because they're benefiting from it. People of Tel Aviv and Jaffa and others, we benefit from a catastrophe that happened to others, and we benefit daily, and it's an economic benefit as well. And most importantly, and this has been said, I think, and this was said in, I think Khulud said that in the context of the Israeli Arabs, definitely the Israeli Arabs, if they have a special responsibility for their Palestinian brethren because of the fact that they live in Israel, they live in a certain of a B-class democracy, and they're not afraid to fly with a computer that has Palestine written in it. And we definitely need to use that privilege and lead to a change. A few days ago, I was driving my car. I was almost involved in a car accident. And once again, I go back to this quote. I think that the entire Israeli society is in a situation that the Nakba is a fact. The recognition of the Nakba is a solid fact, and the argument is about how to treat it. And I heard Steinitz saying on the radio, and I quote, "The Nakba was born from the attempt of the Arabs to destroy the state of Israel upon its establishment." Just like that. He said that before he went abroad. I couldn't believe it that this is exactly what I was hearing. And then I saw that it was Nakba, but in inverted commas. But you can't hear the inverted commas on the radio. So I think this is the place where we're all at. Zochrot today in this conference is taking the next step forward. Just like I said, the return is a necessity. And I do owe Omar a sentence. This is something that I always say. I mean, perhaps we can argue about the form of realization. There are various arguments about how the return will be realized, but I think it is agreed that none of us can take away a refugee's right to return. And I mean, as important as it is to understand that, it is still a necessity, and I would like to say another step forward, another step ahead of the mainstream to want their return. And I sometimes even imagine myself sitting at the port and simply waiting for the refugees to return. So once again, not just to be afraid of it and to deal with the fear. I think that we're dealing with a disease here. We're talking about a sick country, a diseased country with a very serious disease that requires medication. We talk a lot about the various phenomena attached to this. What happens if the Palestinians will return? Oh my God, what happens if the Jews will be uprooted because of them and their culture will change? We'll have women with veils and chadors and the mentality will change, but we want to be healthy. I want it because I love this country. I cannot bear what this country, what this regime is doing to it. It is leaving wounds in this country, in the landscape, and you can hardly... It has even reached a situation that, I mean, to say I'm a Jew, it's like I need to be ashamed of it. My entire identity as a Jew is reduced to my responsibility to the Nakba. It is reduced to the fact that I'm not a Palestinian and the mere definition of a Jew. We talked about the Aliyah, the immigration of the FSU Jews, and the only thing that made them special was the fact that they were not Palestinians. Had they been Palestinian, they would not have been allowed to come. But once they're not Palestinians, their level of Judaism is not that important. And let me share another anecdote with you in this context, something I saw recently on TV, and I quote, "One a bright day, which became the darkest day in my life, we received a letter which said that we must leave this country within 30 days. How can they expect a person to pack his entire life, to put his clothes in a suitcase and leave? And I've learned the language, I've made friends, I covered my gaps in studies, and I can hardly remember Russia. I only have one dream, to receive citizenship and to be drafted to the military." This dream is Daria Perelman's dream. She's from the Ukraine. 24 hours after this program was aired, of course, this was cancelled and she was allowed to remain in Israel. And my question is, when will our dream be realized? I don't think it'll take 24 hours. I think it'll take a bit more than that. And when I came here, I took a taxi. We had a Palestinian cab driver from Jaffa. His name was Saladin. And as we were driving, my wife, Merab, she kept saying, tell him. And I was ashamed, I didn't feel comfortable. I mean... And ultimately, after she left the cab, I was courageous enough to tell him, and he was really and truly moved. A person who was born in Jaffa in 1930, he sent me here with a message of hope, and he said, that lies can never sustain themselves, that a regime or any condition that's based on a lie cannot last over time, and I would like to truly believe that he's right. I have another message of hope here from South Africa. Maybe I'll need somebody's help with this. And I'd like to thank Moran, who took this picture.
It might look like you are hitting your head against a wall. You are not. It's going to happen. And one day they are going to ask each other, why were we so stupid for so long? Like that. Why were we so stupid for so long, causing people unhappiness? You too, you are going to say, hey, why did we do this silly thing? Why did we build a wall? Look at the money we spend, and now the money we're going to spend to break it down.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Ami. Now I'd like to invite Ro'i to present his research that talks about the political problems of education, the approach, and it has to do with the Cape Town documents, especially when the return will be allowed, and in that period the change in our educational system will be necessary. Yes, that's not exactly the topic of my talk, but sort of. I'll switch to Arabic and then I'll switch to Hebrew. This talk will be in the Hebrew language. I really wanted to speak in Arabic, but I tried and I listened to myself. And I wasn't clear. Just like a child talking about philosophy, the philosophy of education, but I did understand from this experience why language is important to me and why this topic, the topic of return, cultural return, why it is important to us. I would like to begin with a family story, a personal story. My grandfather, my late grandfather, told me this story many years ago. He is a Polish Jew from Bialystok. In 1931, his entire family decided that they must move to Palestine, and they all came through the ocean from the Odessa port to the port of Jaffa. They came on a ship, a mother, father, 3 brothers and a sister. And they saw Jaffa from the ship, and all was well. All of a sudden, there were like 20 Arab men aboard their ship. They took all their bags and threw them to the ocean. They just threw their bags to the ocean, and he was really scared. One of them took him and put him on a smaller boat, and he was really afraid. So he was on this small boat with an Arab, you know, with this big mustache, and he was really afraid. And the guy said to him, "Sitz, sitz," in Yiddish, sit down. He said to him in Yiddish, "Sitz, sit." So he sat and rested, and he saw all their luggage in that smaller boat, and he told me that at that moment he realized that if he wants to live in this place, he needs to understand Arabic. Okay, we can switch to and go back to my talk.
Wow.
So, I have a brief comment. Ami earlier gave a quote from Ahmad, and it really threw me back to other places, because in Neve Shalom, I worked in Neve Shalom as well, and we would talk about return there. And I don't know how that aligns with what I'm about to say, because this is something that just occurred to me. And he said to me, he was the principal of the school there, and he said to me that true return will occur when he will have a Jewish employee. He won't feel that it is a problem to be his boss. And, you know, I said this without thinking, but this is something that just, you know, popped into my head. So now, today, I'm going to examine the discourse that we're holding here in the conference and in Zochrot and in general in this political world, what we talk about the right of return, and I'm going to look at it as a practice of educating for post-colonial peace, and I would like to indicate two theoretical problems in the discourse. The first one is the rigidity of the term justice and the fact that it's one-dimensional, and you know the word justice kept recurring during these past 2 days. And another problem is this catch that we find ourselves in when we address identities and that exist here in an essential way. And I'd later on explain exactly what I mean by essential. I am suggesting another philosophical perspective that could help us in order to promote and realize the right of return. And in this perspective, it is cultural return. This perspective does not contradict an activity for the promotion of material and practical return to Palestine, which Noa talked about very concretely, and she also used the word material, so it doesn't negate it. The emphasis in the perspective which I suggest is on a cultural process that is constantly ongoing and which views in the culture a dynamic process that both its structure and its borders keep changing. I see the discourse on the return a kind of education for peace, and it's also because I researched the philosophy of education for peace, so I always see that wherever I look, but especially when I started to explore how can I justify it, because this is a discourse that seeks to influence people, to influence society, and strives for a utopian condition of justice and peace. Anyhow, it doesn't change the idea which I suggest here of cultural return. It doesn't matter if you consider it as education for peace or not, because I did have a few discussions that people were, I wouldn't want to say that they were offended, but they didn't accept it. So let's drop that. So this entire issue of return stems almost completely from the post-colonial perspective, and the post-colonial perspective is an excellent tool to analyze situations and teach us about reality. As for the return, the post-colonial theory views the Nakba as the epitome of the relationship and reflects the power relations between the Zionists and the Palestinians, and more broadly the power relations between Western societies and Arabs. This perspective enables us to discern the impact of context in history and to see the influence of the universality of the Western perception of justice. As a result, such a post-colonial perspective raises to awareness the arbitrariness and injustice in the distribution of resources and the urgent need for change. And of course, the post-colonial perspective also refers to cultural power relations. Both Said and Spivak talk about cultural imperialism, using imperial force in order to prefer one culture and oppress and depress the development of another. It's quite obvious to everyone that America's influence in the world doesn't just stem from their political and from their military and economic power, but from their cultural might as well. The cultural return will serve as a resistance to cultural oppression when the purpose is to overcome the post-colonial power relations and foster a successful culture that integrates other cultures. Despite the rationale in this cultural approach, the natural connection between it and the post-colonial perspective in which we discuss, and there are two main obstacles, inherent obstacles within the post-colonial discussion on return that prevent a course of action of cultural return. And the first obstacle is the perception of justice, and the second obstacle is the essential identity. So what is this perception of justice, which I call it rigid and unidimensional? Post-colonial justice will be created by reversing the colonial act. And Abu Sita spoke here yesterday, and he spoke to us. Even though he wasn't here, he still managed the way to find a way to impact us through the video, in case you weren't here. And I think that he represents this approach to justice, or this perception of justice, because in his view, justice will be achieved through the reversal of the war crime of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. He calls it to reverse the war crime of ethnic cleansing. The problematic nature of this perception of justice has many dimensions. Let me mention a few. You cannot delete history. Being a refugee is not something that you can take back, not even through return. Any kind of thought on how to delete the past or imagine what things would be like if the past would not have occurred is unproductive. It doesn't have a moral basis. So this perception of justice is not just rigid, it is also unidimensional. It is unidimensional regarding the identity of the criminal and the victim, if we use these terms taken from crime. The question of justice in this case is reduced to a private matter between the Palestinian national movement and the Jewish national movement. The nationality becomes the main criteria according to which people examine the colonial process, so that means it is a national crime perpetrated by one nation against another. Moreover, nationality becomes the main motivation and motivating force in order to reach justice. The assumption is that a Palestinian national revival that will end with sovereignty over the land is justice itself. And it is important to mention that the problem here is not specific to the national aspiration in and of itself, but the essential treatment of nationality, which I shall elaborate on. I'll continue with the problems and the perception of justice.
This entrenchment in regards to the roles, the colonial roles. I mean, the Western is always the oppressing side, the Eastern is always the oppressed, and it's difficult to me to find other examples or examples that would explain what I mean in this particular circumstance, but I did. In the UN Assembly Against Discrimination in South Africa in 2001, they dealt with the question of taking land. The post-colonial discussion was very, very paramount in this discussion, and there were also representatives of the civic society, of organizations that work against apartheid and injustice and oppression of any kind. And Israel was also represented there, and they were very key representatives. But in regards to slavery, they dealt only with the transatlantic slave trade, meaning this trade in which African slaves were sold to the US by Europeans. The sub-Saharan slave trade wasn't even discussed. This was just as big as the transatlantic slave route, but here they were African slaves that were sold, and there they were sold by Arabs. At the end of the conference, they acknowledged the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity, and several Western countries acknowledged their accountability for this crime. The sub-Saharan trade was not even acknowledged. Now, when justice is so rigid, the question is in regards to the moral means at hand in order to reach justice, meaning what are the legitimate means that we have? Samnun, for example, says that using violence against victims is legitimate because it's only a reflection of the violence that the oppressor enacts. In regards to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I know that there are several addresses of this particular issue in regards to the dialogue groups between the two factions, in Neve Shalom, for example, and others, in which one allegation that is made is that you can understand terror attacks and bombings against innocent people. This is something that Halevi and Don Sonnenstein also wrote about, this particular mentality or argument. Justice, this essence of justice is very important. It's a big question, and I would like to talk about the second theoretical basis that I think stops the cultural return of the refugees, and I think that this is a key point. Now, the essential identity principle means that there is one identity of each person and it's never going to change. What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be a Palestinian? That remains the same. You are always a Palestinian. You are always a Jew in the same way. Now, in the Haggadah, the book that Jews read every Passover, they say that every generation people must see themselves as if they themselves were the slaves set free from their slavery in Egypt. The same can be said about the Palestinians and the Hanakba. So, refugee is a status for life. Who is Palestinian is something that is set when the colonial days beginning. Any Arab that lived in Israel in 1948 is therefore Palestinian, according to that doctrine, without anything to do of their own personal decision. They have nothing to say about it. With this kind of essentialistic view, any kind of discussion between cultures is part of the colonial crime, is something that is personally I find very difficult to take, very sad. I'm a Jew that is very interested in Palestinian cultures. I'm considered an Orientalist. I'm considered a person who wants. I'm considered someone who has learned their enemy. And if I'm studying my Jewish heritage, I'm not considered a Palestinian enough, a betrayer of my Palestinian heritage. So this brings us back to the issue of normalization. And let me explain this for a second. Any collaboration, any connection between Palestinians and Jews, according to this doctrine, means that conquest is normal and now what we have peace. Now, I think that this campaign against normalization is meant to really preserve the essentialistic definitions and their mindsets. Now, I want to give you an example, just show you how this works in actual reality. A year ago, a group of Palestinians and Israelis decided on a group delegation to Amman. Now, the Chaos group from Jerusalem had a lot of criticism to say. A lot of criticism is about this delegation, specifically about the Palestinians who are there. A group of Palestinian refugees from Amman published a letter in which they warned that no Jews would be allowed to come to the assembly as part of the delegates, and no Jews would be allowed in. Yes, okay, I get it. All of the Jewish Israelis will not be allowed to come to the concert, and that they have to examine each person personally in the after party so that they're not Jews. At the end of the day, some of the Jews, in fact, did cancel their participation in the delegation to the concert. A month later, some of the Jewish participants criticized on Facebook the project of dialogue between Jews and Palestinians. And those same Jews that were not allowed to go to Amman referred various projects of dialogue between both sides as a process of normalization that is meant basically to reduce the guilt of the Jews. It's very clear that this kind of essentialistic view has nothing to do with cultural return. In order to promote this kind of mentality, we will have to first of all take on a collaborative mentality. It's clear that this kind of essentialist reality has nothing to do with return. In order to do this, we'll have to change the way we talk. Now, I want to say why it's so important, this cultural return. First of all, this is a collaborative, inclusive view. Nobody has to be left out. A refugee in Amman, or a Jewish woman from Ramat HaSharon, or a woman from Safuri who lives in Nazrat, all of them can take part in this effort towards return and maybe also collaborate and work together. And through such a project, we can become an integral part of each other's lives, a way of life that is return. The second reason is political. Cultural return may make some of our actions non-reliant on political reality, and that's a good thing. Because culture generally can evolve and progress without a license and without a visa, and can cross boundaries. And in the end, a cultural return is a mechanism for changing reality that can affect the lives of all involved, and also many others and the broad reality. And a cultural return is not something that is against physical return, it's just another aspect of it. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Ro'i.
Final speaker for this session is Thaer from BADIL, who will present a paper titled Establishing the Right of Return as the Common Principle for Struggle. And I think this paper will discuss how to approach solidarity with the Palestinian cause in a principled way. How can we turn the legal principle of the right of return into the basis for practicing justice in our struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Jumana. And Roy, thank you for problematizing quite a few issues. My talk, I hope to sort of address some of those similar issues, but maybe in a different way. And when I do this talk, I hope I'm going to be avoiding the biggest problem that you addressed, which is essentialism. So some things we heard today, a couple of phrases from the morning. Existence is resistance. Our rights are not a dream. All morning we heard of ways of people who are implementing return. We also heard in the afternoon about people who are planning for the return, a type of spatial theory. These are all visions, some of which are being practiced, of course. They all have in common two important principles: the centrality of the right of return and the representation of displaced Palestinians. These are the principles fundamental to implementing the Palestinian struggle as a whole, a struggle for rights, equality, peace, ultimately. I will build off of the groundwork that my colleague Manar laid out yesterday. A little closer. Is this better? Manar yesterday talked about a holistic approach to the conflict in general, approach of ongoing Nakba. I'm also working for BADIL, so much of my perspective is coming from theirs. So my paper, I will focus on the right of repatriation as the most fundamental right within the human rights approach, and make the case for establishing it as the common principle for struggle. The right of refugees and internally displaced persons to repatriation, return, restitution, rehabilitation, compensation, and non-repetition encompasses the values needed for progress. Of those values, the most challenging to advance within Israeli society is the right of return. Conceptually, it is also the most encompassing image of the vision for the society we strive to implement. For these two reasons, and the sake of simplicity, when I refer to the right of return, I am encompassing both the full legal rights of repatriation and the conceptual vision required to move forward. A tone of neutrality, objectivity, or so-called balance is inauthentic. An objective approach to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, a so-called objective approach, gives way to the hegemonic power dynamic, the status quo, which does not seek an end to the oppressive and exploitative conditions our society exists in. If we agree that we are not satisfied with the status quo, passivity is complicity. An apolitical approach is collusion. The fault of an objective approach sought by humanitarianism, for example, is with the kind of remedy it seeks to provide. This approach, which I will seek to provide a viable alternative to, promotes helping an at-risk population, like the Palestinians, to attain a place of self-sufficiency. It proposes to do this by mobilizing international coordination, skills, and funds to fill gaps that can't be met locally. We see such initiatives replete in Gaza, Lebanese refugee camps in Syria, and with the Syrian refugees in Jerusalem. Context, however, is crucial. The root cause of the conflict, the humanitarian disasters, and the ongoing production of tragedy throughout Israel-Palestine and countries hosting Palestinian refugees is one of refused rights. Rights refused were not a one-time event local to 1948 or 1967, or the attack on Gaza in 2008-2009, or in 2012. No, injustice is much more comprehensive, intractable, and fluid, inheritable, in a word. The refused right of return is a constant and growing presence, not only in the number of the descendants of refugees, but also the cost to the individual. The series of wars, such as against Gaza, are sourced from and built upon a spine of historical injustice. And then there's the daily structural violence embedded in Israel proper, the occupied Palestinian territory, or the Shatat, places of the exile community outside of the homeland. Checkpoints and the apartheid wall are visible and multifaceted examples of this violence. The violence of the siege of Gaza is obvious, I hope. Discriminatory laws that privilege Jews over Palestinian citizens while denying collective rights to the Palestinian community in whole a dynamic of exploitation are well documented and analyzed, although this is a much more abstract form of violence. The poverty, underprovided, and caged urbanism undermined potential of the refugee camps around the Middle East and in Palestine are manifested daily, banal violence. There is also the violence of racism in media. depictions of Palestinians, of Orientalism. The list is endless. This is our context. From such an understanding, aid and assistance projects are supportive but not solutions. The objective, so-called humanitarian project, proposes to ameliorate the trauma, which is ultimately insufficient. This mentality extends past the field of humanitarian relief, which is so often placed front and center as the primary effort to solve our conflict. The logic of assistance is the foundation of the development field in general, which frames solutions of problems in terms of sustainability. In response to complex problems such as ours, the argument progresses that throwing resources at a problem are not enough to create sustainability. Rather, they must be targeted on building structures of self-sufficiency. An example: give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime, goes the cliche proverb. This is the mindset of the dominant approach to the question of Palestine, that a solution is a matter of creating opportunity for the impoverished to elevate themselves from their condition. Besides the assumptions about what is natural for an individual to desire and the vast neoliberal and imperialistic ideology at work within that logic, the basic function when applied to Palestine and Israel is one of ahistoricism. Humanitarian aid, advocacy, or dialogue as ends in and of themselves is a highly tenuous political position to adopt. In a word, it's unsustainable. And as an example of this, we had the offer of a very generous offer of like a quota of 200,000 refugees who could be allowed to return. I think this is another form of the humanitarian kind of logic, which isn't flawed necessarily, but when implemented as the end result, it absolutely is flawed. Rather, instead of a sustainability issue, I'd like to frame the problem of Palestine as, although sustainability is one of the issues, but more fundamentally, it's a problem of misallocation. A misallocation of resources, funding, natural resources, advocacy, but more importantly, a misallocation of politics, of morality. The source of the prevalent structural and outright violence in Israel-Palestine is not a humanitarian disaster in origin. No, that is long down the chain of effects, the extreme manifestation of the basic injustice. Denied rights are the problem, denied rights are the context. Last week, President Mahmoud Abbas addressed the United Nations General Assembly. His plea for peace was conspicuously devoid of the language of human rights. Those principles were largely ignored along with rights-based duties and obligations of the international community. While Abbas said, "I am personally one of the victims of al-Nakba among the hundreds of thousands of my people uprooted in 1948. He said this in order to elicit the stakes Palestinians hold in ensuring peace with Israel. He also made no mention of the individual rights of those hundreds of thousands of refugees, their inalienable right of return. In a sense, that logic behind the peace Abbas promoted was one of humanitarianism as well. The logic is all too prevalent, a logic that puts human rights second. Such an approach to solving our conflict decontextualizes colonialism when what we are seeking is a decolonization itself. Colonialism is the violent thread tying the disparate incidents together. The colonization specific to Israel is one in which the presence of the Palestinian population is detrimental to the vision of a Zionist project. They must be removed, minimized, contained. The dynamics between colonizer and colonized in Israel proper is a precursor to the dynamic between the colonizer and the colonized in the occupied Palestinian territory. Belligerent occupation and institutionalized discrimination are two manifestations of Israeli colonialism. A third exists. Israeli colonialism has reinforced an indelible relationship between land and people, not a small part of which is because Zionism affirms the Jewish people's connection to the land as its central tenet. Aside from belligerent occupation and institutionalized discrimination, the third condition of oppression resulting from Israeli colonialism is the denial of the right of return, the inalienable individual right of a displaced person. The cord between a person and the place from which she was forced to leave, through many tactics, is the fundamental injustice to our conflict. Yes, for Palestinians, the conflict is about land, but more accurately, it is about the people erased from their land, the generations and now millions who have been perpetuated in limbo, a tragic condition replete with the minutiae of exploitation. This is the primary denied right, the right of return. The human rights-based approach, first of all, a caveat, is not an end-all, is also not the fundamental goal. It's a basic minimum of rights, which ultimately will lead to justice, but it does not equate with justice. We have to make that distinction. But what it is tasked with tackling is the basic problems, the source of tragedy, not only in humanitarian terms, but a violence that pervades all Palestinian existence, to varying degrees depending on individual and community challenges. This approach tasks itself with confronting the politics which play a crucial role in building and sustaining this conflict. Sustainable it isn't, and while a role exists to ameliorate people's immediate needs, it is equally, if not more, important to struggle in order to change the conditions which will replicate the trauma as they have been for 65 years. What has been neglected is a project to confront the politics that prioritize state security over human security. A human rights-based approach is an approach promoting equality. Through addressing fundamental injustices, we can reach an ethical resolution. Immediately ahead of us are at least three notions prohibiting public recognition of Palestinians' rights. One, the logic of Israeli colonialism, which is fundamentally exclusive, spawning root causes that perpetuate the conflict. Two, an Israeli fear that acknowledging Palestinian human rights is an exchange with their own rights. Noa dealt with this in her talk. Number three, the entrenched privilege of Jewish Israelis at the expense of Palestinians, especially the displaced. Both Ami and Rai referred to this and addressed the damage. Ami, for example, addressed the damage done to the oppressor and how an oppressor can also be a victim. These are also important nuances that we have to take into account. These three factors that I just mentioned, however, surface as barriers to recognizing progressive principles beneficial to all of us, equal access to rights, all of them, and come with a huge opportunity cost of decades of preventable human tragedy. The means to address this seemingly intractable logic of domination, of power to exclude, of colonization, is through a principled and grounded commitment to the most marginalized Palestinians, their rights of repatriation. The stakeholders in this conflict are not only those 12 million people residing within the borders of Israel-Palestine, but also the 7.4 million displaced Palestinians, most of whom reside outside of the homeland. No matter how you calculate it, prioritizing human rights will always point us to the inordinate burden borne by the displaced. Over and over, we have heard the call for achieving the right of return. How do we heed it? Authentic solidarity is conditional to enabling voice and agency. From BADIL's perspective, which is the refugee rights organization based in Bethlehem, they emphasize a relationship with the most marginalized constituency, refugees. They are front and center in the beliefs and practices of the organization. As such, refugee participation is necessary for the legitimacy of any project. The core philosophy revolves around a belief that achieving justice requires return. Achieving the right of return is one side of the coin. The other half of this refused right is its expanding implementation. The violent uprooting of Palestinians from their homeland was waged in an evolving way from 1947 to the present. Forced population transfer, I might refer to it as FPT, is one of the gravest breaches of international law, punishable as both a war crime and a crime against humanity. Forced population transfer is presently the main engine of the Israeli colonial project. We see it implemented through house demolitions in the Jordan Valley, withdrawn residency permits in Jerusalem, prevention of access to land in the Gaza Strip buffer zone, and relocation of Palestinian Bedouin in the Naqab. All these can be seen as instances of forced population transfer. A couple of suggested approaches. One, focus on preventing continuing displacement. The forced transfer of Palestinians must factor into future efforts that are paired with promoting the right of return. They're very inseparable, the way I see it. Opponents of the human rights-based approach pose an equation in which alleviating Palestinian rights entails a refusal of Jewish Israeli rights. We must refute this false equation. Let's eliminate this from the discourse of possibilities. The Palestinian right of return does not entail the mass displacement or denied rights of Jewish Israelis. Achieving the right of return of Palestinians does constitute the largest hurdle of decolonization. Finally, as valiant steps have been made in this conference, we must promote the idea that Palestinian rights are achievable by demonstrating the possibility of return. I want to just quickly jump to South Africa for a comparative perspective. You saw a video which was born out of a BADIL Zochrot partnership that did a tour or a visit to Cape Town. And among those lessons, which were many, but I want to note one of them, it exposed some important practical lessons about a future transition period. The two organizations participated in multiple comparative field visits. The South African one was the most recent in 2012. One important lesson derived from that visit was the necessity of sustaining struggle for basic rights. It is a continuous duty, before return, during transition, and afterwards. The South African experience with transition is an example in some ways of what not to do. The most progressive constitution in the world has not been enough to reform the structures of inequality inherited from the era of apartheid. The era of Oslo demonstrates a similar lesson of what not to do during negotiations. Palestinian civil society in the OPT deflated during the 1990s. Rather than resting, civil society must maintain and increase pressure to ensure that our principles of equality are followed through during seemingly hopeful periods. The solidarity I am discussing requires standing with the displaced, the ones with most rights refused, the most marginalized, and deferring to their political positions. Doing so entails highlighting the Palestinian narrative of the Nakba and acknowledging the continuing displacement, the forced population transfer produced by the ongoing nature of that original displacement. It entails recognizing the principle of equality as a mutual interest. It includes supporting Palestinian projects attempting to implement return, like the ones we saw today. Ultimately, a cumulative and unified struggle is our goal, so that different actions support, feed into, and build on one another, giving us versatility and coherence. The right of return as the primary principle is the basis for a common approach to challenging the logic of Israeli colonialism. The unifying idea is a promotion of the principle of equality. This is not a zero-sum game. Recognizing the human rights of Palestinians, most importantly, the right to repatriation, is mutually beneficial in order to decolonize Palestine and Israel. Our vision is a society where all people's rights are fulfilled. This is inevitable, natural, and moral. How we get there is the question. Can we avoid tragedy along the way?
There. Last sentence.
Naam?
We should...
Okay, wrap it up. I just had 3 examples of things we should look to. Maybe we can get back to them in the question and answer period, but as just a very brief one, the resistance to the power plan and the Naqab, this is a demonstration of resisting ongoing Nakba. The implementation of return, like in Ikrith, like in Bir'aim, like in a lot of villages that are planning to do this, is an example of implementing the return. And then finally, the most important maybe is building Palestinian representation, specifically one that focuses on representing the displaced. And one initiative attempting to do this is the campaign to register Palestinians for the direct elections to the Palestinian National Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Thaer. قبل ما نبدأ جولة الأسئلة بحب الأول أشكر نوعا وعامي روي.
And answers, I would like to thank all of the participants for their very interesting lectures and for presenting such important issues that should need more than 20 minutes, I'm sure, but I'm sure if we let all of them have more than 20 minutes, they could talk a great deal about those issues, but sadly, because we don't have enough time, we had to cut them off. I would like to add that because this session had to do with so many issues that have to do with Cape Town, I would like to encourage all of you to open the Zochrot website and read the documents from Cape Town, particularly the vision for a future society after the transitional peace and after reconciliation, after justice, and talking about culture and education and the civilization that will come here. And this is now we have an opportunity for questions. I know that Noa has a question that she has to present. Let's begin first of all with Noa's questions, and then we'll see if anybody else has any more. I wrote this down. I prepared this. I prepared this question in writing so that nobody will be surprised, so I gave this out. I wanted to ask him. He talked about the essentialistic identities, which I think is also very important and interesting, and also the question of national essentialistic identities and a national identity which are not essentialistic. And actually, from what he said, I thought to myself that I would actually interpret it in reverse. I would say that even the Palestinian side I would call in reverse, because he gave the comparison of the Jewish idiom that every generation should see themselves as if they themselves were slaves who were freed from Egypt. And the Palestinians, almost similarly, are asked to say to themselves, every generation we are refugees from Palestine. We were deported from Israel. We were expelled. And I think that's exactly not an essentialistic kind of mentality. That's exactly a kind of identity which is a struggle-based, which is built actively by recitation and indoctrination, teaching all Palestinians generation after generation to be refugees. I think this is actually the opposite of essentialistic identity. It's not something that's born, it's something that's taught. And I wanted to see what you think about this. And I'm going to address this very briefly. Maybe we should get a few more questions and then... Okay. Ali?
One thing is very important, and which I don't think I've noticed anyone mentioned in this conference, and that is that Israel itself is obliged to implement United Nations Resolution 194, giving the right of Palestinian refugees for return and compensation. The fact is that when Israel applied for United Nations membership, first time it was rejected. And only when Israel accepted to implement United Nations Resolution 194 and 181, the partition resolution, that is returning to the borders of the partition, that the United Nations accepted Israel's membership. And in fact, Israel is the only member of the United Nations which its membership is conditional on this sort of ground. Therefore, one can safely, I think, say that Israel's membership in the United Nations is illegal because as soon as it became member, it refused to implement those United Nations resolution. And the United Nations resolution I'm referring to is number 273 of 11th of May, 1949, which accept Israel's membership. So I think this is something also we should use and see how, maybe a team of international lawyers should look into this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Yes. Microphone. Sound. Can you... אולי עדיף לעבור לצד השני, או... כן, בבקשה. חנה? חנה, עندك سؤال?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Sorry.
Well, first I want to thank you. It's just a huge effort, and I'm probably speaking on behalf of so many Palestinians who are watching from far away. I just happened to be visiting in Palestine for the last few weeks, and I'm very grateful. The testimonies were very touching. We're on the verge of tears in some cases, especially when imagination is used with some of the pictures. And I was just having lunch with an Israeli friend who just walked out, Sinai Peter, who's a theater director. We're working on a show. And at the huge table of the college where he teaches, some Israeli friends, well, not friends, but students of Sinai were sitting, and he whispered to me, he said, they have no idea, referring to the students who are young, what's going on in the conference. They are so disconnected from what's happening around them. And I guess my reaction to it was, well, maybe that's good. You never know what's behind the door until you knock and open the door. We don't know anything about their reaction to this. And I came and I was a little disappointed by looking at the crowd and not seeing Israeli Arabs as a good present here. In the same way, we don't know. I mean, maybe few, I'm not generalizing here, but I would imagine if somebody's talking about Nakba and the right of return, the auditorium should be filled, and they're not here. The same token goes for the press. I saw nothing in the newspapers, the Arab newspapers, about this, and I was a little disappointed, but maybe I'm just dreaming. So aside
We're
from...
running out of time. So
okay, aside from, I don't know, getting full membership for your organization, Dhakirat, what else can we do with those disconnected Israelis who might be very happy to hear about this, and the Israeli Arabs, the young generation who every time you mention Nakba and Zochrot, they don't want to even listen or hear about it.
Thank you. Can we just make the questions short? No problem.
Hello, I'm coming from France. I'm from French Jewish Union for Peace. Want to thank you for all this brainstorming, very interesting, and want to address some questions to Roy. I was very surprised by some of your interpretations. The first about the slavery in Africa. You don't seem to realize that this is a political manipulation from a very reactionary wing to oppose immediately when we speak about million people. That means a real genocide, the transatlantic slavery. People are immediately opposing the inner African slavery. This is a political manipulation. Second thing, you speak about normalization as a problem, the problem of the fight against normalization. When speaking about justice, normalization must be the result of a justice. It cannot be before. This is the old, very known policy of the Peace Now movements here, to make things, first make dukiyum, you know, the duki problems. Let's speak together and eat your hummus, and then we'll manage to make you generous offers. We've been there, and no more play about this. And that interpelled me about the international part. Israel is not responding to any international law or any human rights, okay? Till then, there is no way of normalization with outside states. And for my opinion, the BDS movement, and especially the cultural BDS movement, are very important in the world to show Israeli people they cannot continue to act as everything was normal. It's not a normal democracy here, and people are very right when they refuse to play this game.
Thank you.
Last thing, please.
Make it quick, please.
Okay. I'm coming from a French colony. I am from Morocco. And I know what it is to live in a post-colonial society like in France. In France, too, people are very afraid of 5 million Muslims, and they don't want to become Muslims like them, and they want to keep their own habits. The vision for Zochrot maybe and here is maybe like in France, a society with creativity, with people there will not be Israeli people as they used to be, Jews, and there will not be Palestinian people as they used to be. But the idea is to create a new society and an equal one.
Thank
and
you.
the last thing I wanted
we're taking
to
a lot
answer.
of time. There are other people
Okay.
who want to.
Yesterday, a woman spoke about the exchange of refugees from the other Arab worlds and Palestinian worlds. And I couldn't speak about that. But Israel managed to exchange population by force. And speaking about Moroccan Jews, they have been taken really by force here. Okay? And if they want to come back to Morocco, they can have a passport immediately. So the right of return is open to them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Orlando. I'll be as quick as possible. My question is around something I didn't hear a lot of addressed here, which is on maybe the role of like psychological therapy in any kind of implementation plan regarding right of return, and what maybe you all feel that would look like. I know some of you touched on it a little bit, but I haven't heard it tackled in depth as to what that would look like in terms of the culture clash and what would ultimately be an after effect of this, or something that should be considered in an implementation plan of right of return, which is the deep psychological effect that the conflict has had, and how that would be addressed to those on the fringe, those that are not here, but those that are from the right wings, those that are not able to be here, or those Palestinians that do not live here and not able to be at this conference. How would you deal with the psychological effect that the right of return would have on both of these populations, and how would that be addressed in any kind of implementation plan moving forward? Or how do you envision that being a part of the political, the other aspects that we've talked about, the practical, the logistics? How is the psychological effect going to be dealt with?
Thank you. I think we'll give them the.
What's his name?
What's your name again? Sorry?
Orlando.
Orlando. Thank you. I'll give the stage for speakers.
Orlando, just a quick reference to your last question. Part of the Cape Town documents have dealt with that issue. As I said in my own statement, both the oppressor and the oppressed suffer from deep psychological issues, and practical return, cultural return, will not be possible without addressing those issues. In fact, what we realized in South Africa, that what would be required is both individual therapy and community therapy. That is, entire communities will have to be healed. And also, for me especially, I became convinced that religion will have to play a very important role, because it would be impractical to, let's say, have everyone sit down on the couch and have his own shrink. Religious leaders like Desmond Tutu and others played a very important role, and which is sorely lacking here on both sides, both Jews and Muslims. Now, yeah. Thank you for that question.
Firstly, to Noa, to answer a question about the difference between essential identity and her saying that the Palestinian identity is constructed and it's in favor of the struggle. I give myself a compliment. I found a very, very nice metaphor. For me, essential identity is like a shirt, pants you receive from your aunt for your birthday, but you are not allowed to return it, and you are not allowed to fix it. I don't know how to say it, to make it like in your length. So the fact that the Palestinian identity is constructed is that you are born a Palestinian, and you are obliged to this certain identity, and even more if you're a refugee. This is your identity, and you are not allowed to go back anywhere and replace it. and even the return will not replace it. And what are your privileges in way of changing what it means inside? It's also very limited because of the struggle, because this identity is necessary for the struggle. For Ali, I thank you for your United Nations reference. In Tel Aviv, for example, when the United Nations declared the establishment of Israel, we call it, it was actually also declaring the establishment of a Palestinian state, and people were in the street dancing. Also, they were, I don't know if they were not aware of that, but this is a very important part of this decision. It's the same, it's inseparable, it's true. About the slavery, you are right. I really don't know about political manipulation because I don't know enough about it. I was giving it as an example for how hard it is to imagine that also people we see as victims, in that case, they were third world countries. They were also a part of slavery system. I'm finishing. About the normalization, it's true. There are people who play, you call it duki, they play in coexistence just to relieve their own conscience. I'm not sure that stopping cultural exchange, contact, and other manners of cultural boycott are the way to solve it and make them do more meaningful things.
Thank you, Roy. Thaer?
Yes. There's basically just two main points that I want to make. One, first about the identity issue. Well, just I think the basic essentialism is to assume that there is only one Palestinian identity. And in fact, the hegemonic type of construction of Palestinian identity is that there isn't one. It is that there isn't a unified type of Palestinian identity. The work of BADIL, we kind of put together a survey of Palestinian identity around the Middle East, and it shows one thing is that there's a lot of diversity, but at the same time it shows kind of the resistance within taking Palestinian identity, and not so much that, in my belief, it's not so much an imposition rather than an acceptance. And aside from that multifaceted aspect, I can give an example. For example, in Jordan, the refugees, Palestinian refugees in Jordan, many of them, some of which are my friends, don't consider themselves Palestinian. They don't consider themselves refugees. They consider that a part of their past that is very distinct from the actual lived reality they experience. And I think a type of answer to explain how that is happening is the context, and you can also plug this into rights. In Jordan, Palestinian refugees have much more rights than Palestinian refugees have access to in Lebanon, for example. And it's obvious that access to rights impacts your identity and your conception of yourself. The other issue I wanted to raise is about the reference to Resolution 194 and 181. True, it wasn't mentioned very explicitly or very often during the conference. Perhaps one of the main reasons is that basically this issue is so politicized, it's tough to really draw anything super meaningful from utilizing it, throwing those numbers around. Israel is obviously a pariah state. The example we can use is that the US invaded Iraq for the same, everything it accused Iraq of doing to justify its invasion is exactly what Israel has done since its inception. Obviously, this is a completely politicized reality, and the violations are well documented. BADIL does much of this work, as do many other organizations, and we bring it up, for example, in submissions to the United Nations. It's an important issue to keep documenting and keep following through, but the fact is that people are disappointed with the results from employing that method. Alone, it's very little return.
Thank you, Thaer. Now, very short. Here, you can use this one.
Okay, sorry. I would like to address two questions. One has to do with the issue of the UN resolutions and the issue of international pressure. I would just like to say that as a legal expert or a lawyer, I feel that when people talk about UN resolutions and international law, it seems as if there's this strong cop standing and turning a blind eye. But no, that's not the case. UN resolutions are violated all the time, day in, day out. International conventions are constantly violated by anybody who's strong. International law, unfortunately, doesn't truly function for any strong country or any country that the U.S. likes. That's an existing situation. To say why is Israel a member of the UN, I think if you would have examined membership to the UN based on complying with the UN resolutions, then many countries would not be in the UN. And as for international pressure, I know when people say that there's international pressure mounting on Israel, we must remember that these countries that every once in a while vote against Israel, usually not only do they vote for Israel, but they also directly fund the continuation of the occupation, exploitation, and Zionist control over Israel. So one can look at it this way as well. International pressure works more in favor of Zionism rather than against Zionism. And another point I wanted to make, simply because nobody really addressed this question. A question was asked what to do about the Israelis and what to do about the young Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. And I would like to bring up a point of hope in my view. I think that Zochrot and all the activities surrounding it has brought the subject of the Nakba to more Israeli youngsters than one could ever imagine. As somebody who's active in the Hadash party, this is a party that never was a Zionist party and talked about the Nakba. I can tell you that 10 years ago, people didn't talk about it the way people talk about it today. That means that today, any student in the university, even if he's a right-wing, then he thinks that the Nakba is a just act. He knows what it is, at least. He knows what it is thanks to this activity because of all these small efforts. And amongst the Palestinian population in Israel, there's a significant rise in their awareness in the past 10 to 15 years. And the activities of the DP committees have increased, and I think that today we're working on it strongly. We need to keep working at it, but we are definitely witnessing a change in front of our eyes. And this conference is not detached from the political reality and social reality of activists, both Jewish and Arab in Israel. I would like to thank everyone. We're going to take a 10-minute break now, and then we will reconvene for the last panel, the last roundtable.